So about 2 months ago, I started reading a book, and the book that I'm talking about is this one that I've got here. It's called Built to Sell, and it's by a gentleman called John Murillo. Now, the reason that I really want to talk about this book, so much to the point that we actually made sure that we got the author on the podcast, is because the lessons from this book I implemented into my business, Station 5, just over a month ago. And in that month, honestly, I can't say that over the 5 years I've been running my business, Station 5, I've seen such a huge transition. I'll get into exactly what happened, but first I want to introduce the author. The author is John Murillo. He's the author of this book called Built to Sell, Turn Your Business into One You Can Sell, and another book called The Automatic Customer. Through his career as an entrepreneur, John has started and exited 4 companies. He recently transformed Murillo & Co. from a boutique consultancy into a recurring revenue model subscription business, which he sold to the Corporate Executive Board, a NASDAQ-listed company in 2008. He was recently recognized by B2B Magazine's Who's Who list as one of America's most influential business-to-business marketers. And to be honest, from this book alone, I've never read a book whereby I've implemented these steps so quickly and had such great success. John, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Hey, Lambros, good to be here. Congratulations on the success.
Thank you. I'm having a bit of like a celebrity moment here where I'm meeting the author of this book, which has been like sitting on top of my bookshelf for the last couple of months. I finally pulled it down and read it. It's been amazing. So the book's been written in a really interesting way. You follow the journey of a fictitious character called Alex Stapleton, who I think represents a lot of business owners. For those who haven't read the book, can you talk us through who he represents, given that particular character ultimately represents a lot of business owners you've worked with over the years?
Yeah, I mean, he's sort of on the sell-do hamster wheel, right? So he's scurrying around trying to find clients and customers. And then when he gets customers, he does the work, and then he sends the invoice and then realizes he's got nothing in the top of the pipeline. And so he scurries around and tries to find more work. And eventually he kind of gets tired of that sort of hamster wheel and realizes that there's got to be a better way. And so that's where he finds himself with, and there's one kind of poignant character in the book, which is it's a parable, by the way. It's as you know, Lambros, it's a fiction, but there's a client who is annoyingly overbearing and it's the individual, the protagonist in the book runs an advertising agency, and the client is this kind of guy that works at a bank who knows nothing about creative and talks to this character about, shades of pink that he wants his logo in, and just, these trivial things that creative people drive them completely nuts. So it goes on and describes the process he went through to change his business.
Yeah. And it's so true. I think it's MNY Bank is the fictitious bank you created, but it was interesting because it resembles so many, I think, small business stories. It wasn't just about MNY Bank and them being the huge flagship client that was really keeping the Stapleton agency alive. It was also the fact that you kind of draw this parallel to the staff member who works within the organization, whose mother works within the bank as well. And the fact that, that staff member was underperforming, but also couldn't be replaced. And despite the fact that, that's not every kind of small business story, I think it resembles a bit of a metaphor for a lot of these situations that small business owners kind of put themselves into. And realistically, what it results in is a business that is not scalable and isn't saleable. But the one thing I also want to get across to our listeners is that one thing, when I saw the title of the book, Built to Sell, I thought, I don't want to sell my business. That's not my ambition. But it was through reading the book that I realized these aren't strategies to create a business that you necessarily want to sell. It's about creating a business which is saleable, but ultimately that doesn't mean that your ambition needs to be to sell. It could be that your ambition is to scale. And when you kind of get to the end of the book, John, it becomes very clear that that's another, I guess, outcome of these lessons. Why is it that entrepreneurs shouldn't necessarily have this mentality of I don't want to sell, but should more so be thinking in the mind of what a buyer of a business would ultimately want to see in a business?
Yeah, because I guess, buyers are pretty smart, right? And among the smartest people in business, and they buy businesses that are likely to thrive in the future. And so using what a buyer looks at when they evaluate a company can be a great measure for how you're doing as an entrepreneur. Like a lot of owners, I think, use top line revenue or number of employees as their kind of yardstick, right? They'll say, "Oh, we hit 10 employees. Oh, fantastic! We hit $1 million in turnover." And these are sort of it just gets pumped out a little bit when they reach these kind of milestones. And while they're worth celebrating, they can come actually at the expense of the quality of your company. Like most founders could reach $1 million in annual sales by firing all their salespeople and simply doing the selling themselves, right? Because they're the ones who are the best at selling. They're the rainmaker. Their name is on the door. In many cases, they're usually the most compelling salesperson. But if you do that, you'll hit your bogey, your top line revenue goal, but you'll do it at the expense of your value. And so I think thinking about your company as a transferable asset, like what would make it like something that someone would want to buy. And if you distill that down to its most basic element, it is, could your company thrive without you personally in the company? For a business to have transferable value, by definition, it needs to be able to be transferred. So it has to work without you. And that's, a lot of people say, "Oh, I'll think about that when I want to sell." And in many cases, that's way too late. They build this sort of empire underneath them that takes way too long and is too cumbersome to unwind. But if you kind of go and start with the end in mind, and you think about who the natural acquirers are for your company from the beginning, you start to make much more nuanced decisions along the way. I think of revenue as sort of vanity, right? I mean, it's an easy number, but the much more nuanced concept of value and what others would value, I think, leads to sort of better decision making down the road.
Yeah. John, I've implemented what's in your book. So I'm someone who had this question. I know a lot would when kind of going through it. People who've been running their businesses for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, you're now turning around and saying, "Hey, you should majorly transform what you're doing." The first thing that goes through the mind is pushback. It's, wait a second, I built up a reputation. I've got clients in this space. I can do everything. We do everything for our clients, and we provide great customer service. And we're top of mind for them when it comes to XYZ projects. Yeah. Why in the world would I want to consolidate what I do down to a single recurring or subscription-based model? Why in the world would I want to do that? It's gonna completely mess up everything I've built over the last decade.
Yeah, in a word, referrals. Because if you do one thing better than anybody else, so let me back up. One of the 8 drivers of company value we talk about is this notion that you have monopoly control, meaning you do one thing better than anybody else. In Alex Stapleton, the character in the book, it's logos. But the process of going through and figuring out the one thing which you are better than anybody else anyone else in the world in delivering allows you to create pricing authority. When you have pricing authority, you get better margins. Better margins allows you to expand the business. But the big thing is referability. And if you think back to the last time you referred someone, maybe it was your dentist or a car mechanic or a website designer, someone who you can think of that you referenced or made a referral to, chances are they're a specialist and they're probably not a generalist. And again, generalist companies are not attractive to acquirers because an acquirer looks at a business. I'm not sure how it works in Australia, but in North America, we have these cable packages with television. Do you guys have the same thing where you have 100 channels? Yeah. So you get 100 channels and you want like 3, right? And the same thing is true of a business. When an acquirer looks at a business and they see a company that does a dozen things, one of them really well, 11 of them poorly, they know that as the founder, you're going to want to be paid for all of your revenue and all your profitability. But as an acquirer, they're looking at it saying, I only want the 1/12 of that business, and I'm willing to pay a premium, but only for that very small slice of revenue. And so it can be a bit of a mug's game, sort of spinning all the plates in the air, trying to support a wide variety of products when it doesn't make you referable, and ultimately it could even draw down the value of your company. It's not neutral. It's usually net negative, having too many things that you do.
Yeah. And let's talk a bit about staff. So you bring people into the business who are also generalists. I think a lot of startups say, hey, this is James, and James is really great because he wears many hats. He's our jack of all trades. What are the faults in that particular industry? Like, do you see faults in hiring people who are the jack of all trades, who can't focus on just one particular offering?
Yeah, in particular, I'm not a big fan of hiring people that come from the professional services world. So advertising agencies, graphic design studios, architectural firms, law firms, consulting firms, because they tend to want to reinvent every problem in a different way. They're generally, there's an old saying that service companies have a real tough time productizing, but product companies don't usually have as much time adding a service layer. And that's usually because service professionals tend to want to reinvent. They also don't love being the McDonald's of whatever industry they're in. So creative people in your industry, if you tell them, okay, all we're going to do is SEO from now on, they're going to look at you and say, that's not what I signed up for. I love to express myself through my creativity, or I love to strategize with big clients like banks. And that's just not what I want to do. And again, I would say, do you want a hobby or do you want a business? Because if you want a hobby, that sounds great. You can exercise that muscle of creativity. And you can do all these projects. At the end, you will shut your doors and never sell your company. If you want to have a company, you can flex that muscle, that creativity muscle, by building your company, like by designing the way customers come into your business, by designing the customer experience, by designing all the materials around your unique process. That's where you should inject and marshal your employees to inject their creativity, but not solving customer problems, because there's nothing transferable about custom challenges that people have. It's not transferable.
Yeah. Yeah, got it. I mean, I found it was fascinating that, when we started to go through this consolidation process, the staff who we have who weren't from that professional services background were incredibly fond of the transition. They found that they were doing 3 or 4 things that they didn't like, and now they got to focus on just one particular outcome. For context, for the listeners who don't know Station 5, Station 5 is a software development agency. Historically, we would help with everything from not just software development, but the testing process, the cybersecurity, and not just, standard kind of software testing and cybersecurity. We'd go to lengths beyond just your kind of standard application. We ended up doing consulting and helping companies to understand what their initial go-to-market strategy should be. And it becomes very noisy. And where we kind of consolidated things down was about providing a subscription model that ultimately allows businesses to engage our developers, our production team, full time. What this means is that who we're selling to ultimately varies significantly. We're more so selling to the creative agencies, to the large consultancies who need to expand their development teams and have access to developers on a subscription basis of 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. So your minimum terms a month. So we've effectively, in some respects, identified that it's an industry that is largely becoming, to a degree, commoditized, and where your creatives and your consultants need developers, but they don't want to pass the work and lose ownership by sending it over to a development firm. And so what we did was we consolidated our offering into one, which is pretty much, we have software developers. And you can effectively hire them full time through us. We will do the management of them and make sure that if for whatever reason they're no longer working with us at Station 5, we will replace them. But we manage that process of making sure that we find developers who are experts with the technology that you need. We track them down. We get them up to speed with standard processes and procedures that work with your business. Which at this point are largely industry standard anyway, and they're with you on a month-by-month basis. The benefit is, and this is straight out of John's book, is that they pay at the start of each month, which means that we're not chasing payment for work already done 3 months after the project's due. So they're paying at the start of each month for the month that's about to happen. and it proceeds like that on a recurring basis. And since we actually went ahead and incorporated this model, the first feedback I got back from the developers was, this is great. We only have to work on one technology now because that's all we're being brought in for, which means they can specialize much more in just one technology instead of sitting across 3 or 4 projects with different technologies. And on the flip side, of our 10-person production team, we've now got 8 who are engaged under this model in a period of 1 month, that is, since we set this all up. So it's been a really exciting transition for us. One of the hardest things that we had to acknowledge within this process was that there are some clients who just aren't going to want to adopt the new model. And unfortunately, they're going to have to be let go of. John, what do you say to businesses who come to you and say, we don't want to lose our biggest accounts. We don't want to lose the MNY bank who is funding, 50, 60, 70% of our revenue?
Yeah, again, I would say that your business is unsellable in those circumstances. So if you have a client who's generating 60, 70% of your business, you're just on a hamster wheel. You're treading water, you're going nowhere, because an acquirer looking at that business will look at it and say, well, if that client leaves, your business is worthless. And so it feels good to have a big client. It may provide some cash flow, but unless if that's all your goal is to derive, a stipend, a salary, a bonus, a dividend out of your company, which is totally legitimate, but it's not building anything. And the problem with that is that it sucks resources away from what your vision is. If your vision is to do something specific, a big client tends to suck resources. They tend to suck attention. They suck all the air out of the room. And what never really happens is you don't ever get to what you really want to get to. I had a chance to get to know Jason Fried a little bit. Jason runs Basecamp, formerly 37 Signals. And he talked to me about the transition to Basecamp, because in the early days, Basecamp or 37 Signals was a digital design shop. They did, websites. And they built some software in the back end that helped them manage projects because they found Microsoft Project difficult to work with. And some clients started asking me about this really simple to use project management software. And Jason said, yeah, I guess I can, sell it to you, whatever. And over time, he didn't realize it, but he was building out a SaaS product in the background. He went so far as to replace all of his revenue he was getting from major client work with this SaaS product that, $10, $20, $30, $50 a month per client, per customer, but he replaced all of it. And that's when he turned off his customer work. And I asked him about that. And he said, I hated the feeling. And Jason, if you know him, he's a very independent guy. He's a very independent thinker. He wrote a book called Rework, and he's a very independent guy. And I said, what didn't you like about the old business? And he said, I hated that feeling of being beholden to a client. That sense of always having to, do what they say. And even though he knew that they were proposing ideas that were wrong-headed, that he had to do it because they were writing a check for $60,000 or $70,000. And he loved that sense of independence that comes from having, tens of thousands of really little customers, and no one of them could tell him where or what he wanted to do. And I think at the core of a lot of owners, and this is a way to pressure check yourself if you're thinking of starting a company. If you're in a corporate job, for example, and you're wondering, is entrepreneurship for me? I think at the core of a lot of owners is the need for independence. And they would sacrifice just about anything for the ability to say, F you, I don't want to do it that way. I don't want to serve that client. I don't want to, whatever. So that's Jason. And I really his comments really resonated for me.
Yeah, definitely. No, I was familiar with the story of Basecamp, where I think it was a few customers would walk through the office and see the software on the computer and ask, "Hey, what's that?"
Yeah.
And they went from a creative agency to a global piece of software. Let's talk a bit about SaaS companies. The example in the book is with an agency, the Stapleton agency, and it's very clear kind of what that transition looks like of kind of taking designers or creatives and ask them to follow a set procedure, and taking the business owner and separating them from the production side or the day-to-day operations. When it comes to a SaaS product, how is it that a manager who could have been someone who was, say, a developer or a designer and was actively contributing to the product, how is it that they step out? And I look at examples like, say, Microsoft even, where, as we know, Bill Gates was quality controlling every line of code in the operating system up until Windows 95. How is it that companies founders can step out of the day-to-day, the production side of SaaS-based businesses, and should they be?
Interesting. Yeah, I think SaaS is pretty sexy, and lots of people want to be in SaaS businesses, software as a service businesses. I think, I would draw the distinction between a software as a service business and a simple subscription-based business. So they're similar. Most SaaS companies are based on a subscription business model, but the subscription business model can be adopted by a much broader set of companies. So clearly SaaS companies can, but even, carpet cleaning companies can bill on a subscription basis if they have recurring service contracts. So first of all, I would ask yourself, do you really have a SaaS company in that you have a piece of software that sits on a server in the cloud and that people access through the internet? I mean, that's a very specific, type of product versus a subscription business, which can be lots of, high street businesses that move to that model. Most of the SaaS founders, not most, a lot of the SaaS founders that I've dealt with are multi-founder companies. So it's not just one owner. Even Bill Gates, you bring up Microsoft, well, there were multiple founders, right? I think the founding team was 9. A lot of these SaaS companies have a product lead who is a very deep product person, thinks deeply about the product. And then you have, in many cases, sort of more of a sales and marketing front end UX guy or gal who is more about like, how do we sell this? How would we market it, et cetera. So it's rare to find both of those skills in one person. Most SaaS companies run out of money really quickly because they bill on a monthly usually basis, and therefore they need to raise money. And so a lot of them are working with other people's money, VCs or private equity or whatever. So have the luxury of having multiple founders and lots of people on staff because they've got outside money, which is not something, the typical small business has access to.
Yeah. I do want to talk a bit about kind of going from small business to multinational. But before we get into that, there's one piece of the puzzle which is vital, which is bringing in salespeople. There are some great lessons in the book about hiring 2 salespeople first, so that there's a sense of camaraderie, but also competition. When is the right time for a small business to bring in salespeople if conventionally the founder or the co-founders have been the ones who have been driving sales?
As soon as you can codify your sales process, it's probably the time to bring in salespeople. And when I say codify, I mean actually document the process so that someone else could follow it. And a lot of times founders think that they have done that, but what they have underestimated greatly is that they are typically the technical expert in their company, right? And as a technical expert, they have just mountains of credibility. And they lean on that either subconsciously or consciously when they sell. So they can document the sales process for a salesperson, a new salesperson, but they'll often find that person will fail because they don't have the credibility and the gravitas that they have because they've been in the industry. And again, this gets back to the importance of doing one thing. You referenced the company who said like 70% of my revenue comes from, a broad swath of products and services. Why would I ever walk away with that? Well, part of the reason you want to walk away from that is it's undermining the value of your company. Number 2 is you'll never find salespeople that can sell a broad breadth of products because salespeople tend to really thrive on repetition, right? They want a talk track, they want a deck, they want referrals and references and case studies, and they want to master those. And once they've mastered them, they become compelling in delivering a sales presentation. But the wider you are in products and services, the more products and market fit you've got across different segments, the more difficult it is for salespeople to actually master their pitch. So look, if you can document your process so that someone else can follow it, I think the time is ripe to do that. And the key lesson is don't hire one. Hiring one usually means that you are held hostage by that individual. You give them all the territory, all the universe to go sell to, and you're never sure if they are successful. You're never sure if it's because they're a great salesperson or because you have a fantastic product or your process works. Hiring two, even if it's just two, gives you competition. You play one off the other, making sure that they are being genuine in their approach, and you'll know whether you have a successful product or just one successful salesperson.
Mm. You mentioned there, like, how do you quality check the effectiveness of the salespeople? Equally though, you need to set an initial KPI, initial benchmark with respect to kind of what your expectations are as to how they should be performing. How do you set that first KPI?
Well, I mean, I think you have to start looking at some sort of sales pipeline or funnel, right? So in early days, most sales pipelines, again, this depends on the nature of what you're selling, how long the sales cycle, but they traditionally go through a classic sales cycle where you've got sort of awareness, where you put people in the top of the funnel and you educate them over time, sort of middle of the funnel, you build a value proposition, and that they, and then ultimately you close them. So you take them through a funnel. And what I would be looking for is at each stage, are they mastering each stage? So are they able to prospect effectively, right? I mean, if you're creating demand for them, that's different, but are they able to go find the prospects and get them on a call? Great. They've passed through the first gate. Now,
Yep.
The second gate is, can they move people from the first phone call or the first interaction into the second interaction? And once they've mastered that, then you're going through this gating process. So a lot of business owners say, yeah, I hired a sales guy, never worked out. And that's unfortunate, but one, you may not have given them the proper training, but
Yeah.
two, what you want to do, I think, is break down the training into small gates that they have to sort of pass through in order to get to the ultimate goal, which is making a sale.
Yeah. I know that the model that we've discussed is very, I guess it acts as a huge catalyst for referrals, because when you specialize in that one particular outcome or that one particular service, that's where you become very referable. Would you say that means there's less of a requirement for having a kind of dedicated marketing team that's carrying out, I guess, outreach and brand awareness, because referrals really become your primary generator of new business?
Well, I think you have to decide if you're going to be inbound or outbound, right? So an inbound company relies on inbound leads and then has some, inside salespeople generally who close those leads. And there are plenty of examples of companies like that. And then there are obviously outbound oriented companies, or outbound companies will identify, a target segment and go after them. Outbound companies generally are putting a lot more emphasis on their sales channel, and they're hiring, sales development reps to set up meetings, and they're doing a lot of investing in that sales channel. And so if you have a more complicated product, has a longer sales cycle, you're probably better served by an outbound channel, right? If you have a relatively easy to explain product, maybe a lower price point and a shorter sales cycle, you're probably going to be best served by an inbound channel. There are obviously exceptions to that and examples that fall outside of that, but that's probably how I would be thinking about it. And the more especially for an inbound channel, you don't have the luxury of being eyeball to eyeball with the customer and pivoting, listening for what they're looking for and kind of redesigning your solution on the fly and saying, well, it sounds like what you need is your problem is X, and therefore we're going to give you Y. You don't have that luxury. And so in an inbound model, it helps to have one thing that you're exceptionally good at. And that's relatively easy to explain.
Yeah, got it. Let's talk a bit about kind of growing the business beyond that point. The point that the book kind of gets to. The book obviously is focused very much on Alex Stapleton, who wants an acquisition and goes through the process step by step of how he gets to that outcome. Firstly, I breathed a sigh of relief at the end of the book. I think it's one of those moments where you think, geez, it can't be that easy. But it also kind of makes you think, where the business got to in terms of the size of the business and the scale that Alex was starting to achieve, you really start to think he could have really taken this business on his own to amplify globally. What he wanted was an acquisition. He wanted to get out. What if your ambition is to go global? At what point do you start to introduce new service offerings? Is that a problem? Do you try and take that one service offering global or as far as you can take it? John, what do you tell the entrepreneurs who want to take it to that next level and don't want to get out when Alex got
out? I tell them, there's never a better time to sell than when things are going well. That you can put one foot on the economic rung of the ladder, take some money off the table, and never ever fall below that rung on the socioeconomic level, layer. A lot of first-time entrepreneurs think I'm going to go global, and they focus on kind of raising money, and they winnow away a lot of their freedoms by bringing on outside investors, many of whom have preferred share rates, or preferred share rights, which oftentimes dilute the business down to nothing. I had the chance to talk to Rand Fishkin. Do you know Rand? He does SEO Moz.
No, I don't. I know the product SEO Moz though, yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah. So Rand wrote a great book. It's definitely worth reading, called Lost and Founder. And he had an interesting story. He gets approached. He has an SEO product, that's a search engine optimization product. And he gets approached by Brian Halligan at the time, and still to this day, to my knowledge, still runs HubSpot, one of the big marketing platforms.
Yeah.
And Halligan wants to buy Rand's company. It's generating about $5 million in annual revenue, and it's a SaaS company. And Brian offers $25 million of cash and stock. And Rand is growing quickly and thinks his company is going to get to 10 million the next year. And he's heard that very fast growth, ultra fast growth SaaS companies traded about 4 times top line revenue. And so Fishkin in his mind thinks, well, this is a $40 million company. And Halligan says, no, it's not. It's a $25 million company. And Fishkin says, no, I'm not going to sell. And so instead he does what you're describing. He goes global and decides that he's going to launch 7 different products, all of which have less and less to do with SEO, and the results are not surprising. He raises a bunch of money from a venture capitalist. The venture capitalist takes what's called preferred share rights, which basically means that they are guaranteed a return before the founder is able to access any cash whatsoever.
Yeah.
Rand has too much money and loses focus to the point where the venture capitalist takes Rand out of the company. And Rand is now a minority shareholder. When I spoke to Rand for my podcast, I said, tell me what that offer would have been like. And had you accepted the offer? He said, well, first of all, I would have had $25 million in my genes. Second of all, part of that was in HubSpot stock. And given the growth of HubSpot stock, that offer would now be more than $200 million. When I interviewed him, I said, what's your net worth today? And he said, my net worth is about $800,000, and most of which he was about to spend on elder care for his parents. The shares he still owns in Moz are in his own mind probably not worth very much, again, because these VCs have preferred share rights. And it's just a cautionary tale about going global. So I'm very skeptical of this idea of scaling up and growing at all costs. I think it's much better to build a product, build a company, sell it, take the proceeds, park half of it, reinvest some, build another product. I mean, most of us as entrepreneurs, we love the game. We love the start. We love the fun, the excitement of trying to find a product market fit and the newness. Very few of us love the monotony of growing a business from $5 to $500 million. I mean, personally, I've never done it and don't aspire to. I think there is much more fun to be had by building up 2 or 3 $5 million companies than one, $20 million company, as an example.
Yeah, it's that rush at the start, right? Like that rush of, yeah, as you said, finding the product market fit, selling to the first few companies and validating that, and then, really starting to grow it, set up the processes. But I think once you get to a certain point in that growth, I think that initial excitement kind of starts to disappear, because ultimately the newness is gone.
Yeah, you think about what it takes to take a company from scratch, nothing, from idea. You have to have a set of skills to conceptualize something, to have the risk tolerance to basically see it through despite nobody seeing it tangibly in front of them. You have to have the salesmanship and again, the willingness to deal with ambiguity, the ability to pivot and be agile all the way through those startup months until you can actually throw enough against the wall that something sticks. Well, those are exactly the wrong attributes to run a large company. That's like a job description of a disaster waiting to happen, right? Like if you're good at the idea generation and all that stuff, yeah, those things are place a high premium on in the first couple of $1 million in revenue, and they're actually liabilities if you want to go from 10 to 100 million. They're like you don't want that guy in the room, because they're a disaster. So I just think, look, most owners, I think, reach a point, and we've seen it in our own work at Value Builder, they reach a point at 3 million, 5 million, 7 million, 10 million, and they pull up and they go, oh my gosh, if I sold this company, I would never have to work again. Like I would have enough money that, as long as I wasn't stupid and didn't need private jets and all the craziness, I would have enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life. Most owners, when they reach that point and realize that they have reached that point, also realize that every day they hold their company is another day they've got all their chips at the poker table, right? They are all in. And I know 2 entrepreneurs who I spoke with around January, and we're recording this in May, kind of still in the kind of depths of this pandemic, who said, I was thinking of selling, but, I've had just a great year in 2019. I think we're going to hold off for another few years and sell later. Well, as you might imagine, now they wish they had made that decision differently, right? Because what they hadn't realized is that they were all in. They were all in on the poker table. And nobody knows when the next black swan event is going to happen. And if you sell, park the cash, and go start something else, you never have to worry about dropping off that rung on the economic ladder. So I think, sorry, I got me on my high horse on this concept of growing.
No, fair enough. Fair enough. There's one other pathway which is very similar to kind of, keeping all your poker chips at the table, as you say, and it's keeping the business alive. And retaining ownership of that business, but getting another manager in to keep it at the level that you've grown it to. So not necessarily continuing that crazy growth, but continuing at maybe a very steady 10% year on year, or even just trying to stay where you are, and keeping that going. Obviously getting some, recurring revenue out of that, and using that to fund your lifestyle, to fund other business opportunities and anything else. What are your views on that, John?
Yeah, look, I think if you can feel very confident you're going to grow, north of 10%, like if you're going to grow 20, 25, 30% with a 2IC, a second in command, a general manager running your company for you, and you can screw off to the beach or whatever, I think it's worth considering very carefully, and it's a great option. The reality though is if you feel confident they're going to be able to like kind of keep the business going, grow at 5%, 10% a year, I would say, why would you bother? Because you can get that out of the stock market. You can basically take the money, invest it in a diversified set of stocks, and then have the ultimate in freedom, right? Whereas if you're still holding 80% of your net worth in a company you no longer run, and that company's only growing 5 or 10% a year, why would you hold that kind of equity in your personal portfolio at such a massive, without lack of diversity, to only get 5 or 10 or 15% growth every year? So I think if there's a company near you in New South Wales called Dimple. Do you know, are you familiar with the company Dimple?
Rings a bell. Yeah.
Yeah, the great guy. Damian James is the guy who founded it. Built it up to a couple $1 million in revenue. They do up, they're foot doctors, and they do podiatry clinics in old age homes.
Yeah.
And so they do these contracts on subscription basis. They go around, and he built it up to, I can't remember, a few $1 million in annual revenue, but he was just kind of stuck there. And what he had was the opportunity to hire a chief operating officer who had a lot of experience in the industry. It's kind of growing a business. And he brought this guy in, and within 2 years, they went from like 3 million to, I want to say, over 10, maybe 12 million. He ended up selling the company for $13.4 million. That's a different proposition than bringing in a caretaker who's going to grow your company, 5 or 10% a year. I really struggle with the caretaker idea, because I think it's going to be, number one, really tempting for you. It's going to be too tempting for you to step in and run it with someone who's just kind of average at doing it. Number two, you just lack diversity in your portfolio. Why bother if the growth is only 5 or 10 points? You can get that by investing in Telstra and ANZ and all big companies that are well managed. Whereas if you've got someone in a chief operating officer or a president role, a general manager, who you think has the capacity to kind of like really grow the business, then I think it's worth considering. Yeah,
got it. I think just coming back to that kind of global mindset, I think it sounds like, if you want to go, if that is a pathway that the entrepreneurs listening want to go down, where you go do the seed capital raise, get some initial cash in the door to then build out your initial product, then do a series A, B, C, D, and all the way through to Z. I think what you need to accept very quickly is that you're going to ultimately need to sacrifice the large majority of ownership of that business, which means that you lose the control to do things the way you want to. I think it's a reality that a lot of entrepreneurs don't really think too much about. They see it as getting capital so that they can do the things that they want to, not realizing that 2-3 years down the line, they actually lose that very control that they just traded away. On the flip side, what we're spoken about, John, I see very much as the kind of bootstrap mentality. It's about kind of having something that is either self-funded or didn't need funding at the start, or perhaps had a very small amount of funding, whereby you still retain control. The idea is that you're very excited about that initial rush, that initial cash constraint for the first 12 to 18 months. And it's about building something from 0 to 10, not from 10 to 100, and going global. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there's a fundamental decision that most owners need to make is do you want to be famous or rich? And venture-backed companies create entrepreneurs who are famous, but very few of them become rich. There is a litany of companies that get funded to the tune of millions of dollars by VCs, and the founders get nothing or very little out of the occasion. Sure, there are the Mark Zuckerbergs and so forth that are venture-backed companies that do well, but they are in the vast minority. Whereas I think the path to wealth is finding a tiny little corner of the universe that very few people care about, where the competitive restraints are limited, that you can actually create a high margin business in a very small little corner of the market, and become irresistible to an acquirer who wants to add your product, your service to their stable. And so you make great margins along the way, and then you sell your business, which you own 100% of, or a very high majority of it. And I do this podcast. I've done 250 episodes now, and I can tell you that the people who create enormous wealth are generally the ones who don't go down the road of venture capital. There are very few examples in my show. I just interviewed Gabby Isturiz, I think is how you pronounce her surname. She built a timekeeping app for lawyers, and what her proposition was to do it so that lawyers could keep time, like client time, billable time, on all of their apps, and they would all sync up. And she built this business up, not a big business, like I think $5 or $6 million in annual revenue. She got She thought it was worth between 5 and 7 times top line revenue. She sold it to Roper, a Fortune 500 company, public company. She got them to increase their offer by 40%. And it is, an absolutely bootstrapped company, no outside capital. And it's made her fabulously wealthy as a result. I could go on. There's hundreds of examples of that on the podcast, but that's a theme that I see a lot.
Yeah. Do you want the fame or do you want the wealth? I guess is what it really comes down to, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, businesses, the media loves recognizing growth. If you look at the BRW 100, do they still do that in Australia? The BRW 100?
Yeah, it's called the AFR 100 now, but yeah, it's the same thing. Yeah.
It used to at the time. I think it probably does still. It celebrates top line growth rate, right? It's like, what's the 5-year annual
only top
growth
line?
rate?
You could be operating at a loss, but if your top line looks strong,
and you could have gotten all kinds of, diluted yourself down to single digits, and you make the front page of that list. And it makes you feel good. It makes people recognize you on the street. They know you know who you are when you show up at the pub. But in my mind, it's not the way to run a company. It very, very, very rarely is it the way to go, unless you have something where speed to market is the ultimate currency, and you have the next Instagram as an example, where you must take that turf. People think they have that business, but very, very, very few people actually do. And where speed to market is important. In most cases, it's not. Most ideas have been around for hundreds of years, and it comes down to the person who does it with a slight tweak, a slight improvement, and that's the company that wins.
Yeah. Yeah, and a great finishing note. Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for today. For those who are interested, check out Built to Sell. It's a phenomenal book, even if you're not looking to sell. It's about creating a business which is scalable and can operate without you there in the day-to-day. It's definitely one of the most insightful books I've ever read, and actually implemented, as I said, within a few days and seen results in a month. It's been absolutely crazy. Awesome. John, thanks so much for your time being on the podcast. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Lambros.